Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning, friends. So, today we are going to take up the third unit of the first section, that is speaking about the sociological analysis of rural phenomenon. So, I think when we try to speak about the sociological analysis of the rural phenomenon, I think the basic understanding is that it tries to speak about scientific interpretation of the rural phenomenon. I think when we try to speak about that, I think we have spoken about in the previous discussion that what were the various theoretical and the methodological issues which are involved and which makes this rural sociology as a specialized discipline in terms of understanding about the rural society. So, when we try to speak about the sociological analysis, it may involve a battery of concepts which are to be used, and these concepts are seen as the eye opener, or they are basically seen as what one can say that when we want to enter into the world of rural, then we have to have the understanding about these concepts. So, these concepts have been used in terms of a specific theory, or sometimes they are being used in terms of understanding a specific phenomenon which is with regard to the Indian society. So, these concepts I think are the part and parcel of rural sociology, and the concepts are being talked about and dealt by the various sociologists and social anthropologists. And if I name a few concepts, so the concepts that comes in our mind are the concept of little community, that is one prominent concept. Then we also speak about the concept of the folk urban continuum, and we also speak about the concept of dominant caste, and also we try to speak about the Judgement system, and we also have an important concept of Sanskritization. So, friends, these are the battery of concepts. I am not saying that these are the only concepts, there are other little and the smaller and the different concepts are there which are being used in a specific sense, but I think keeping in view the structuring of this unit, we can have the understanding about these concepts, so that we can have a better understanding about how we try to see the rural processes in terms of our sociological interpretation. And most of the terms which we try to see, which has been talked about, I think they are basically been talked about by specific scholars. Like if you try to speak about the concept of little community, it has been spoken about by Robert Redfield. If you try to speak about folk urban continuum also has been spoken about by Robert Redfield with regard to the specific setting. The dominant caste, which has been used by Professor M. N. Srinivas. Then the Judgement system, it has a bearing from various scholars, but especially we try to see the contribution of Weiser, W. H. Weiser, who is instrumental in defining and understanding the Hindu Judgement system. And then also we have the concept of Sanskritization, which basically speaks about the changeology in the caste system. So, this is again given by M. N. Srinivas. I think apart from that, we can have battery of other concepts like speaking about universalization, or parochialization, which has been talked about by McMarriott, so I think we can keep on going dealing with these concepts, but I think to be more focused, let us try to tackle the first 5 concepts that we have tried to spoke about, especially when we try to see the understanding about the little community. The important thing that comes in our mind is that the little community is to be seen in a specific sense, and this is basically a significant work which has been talked about by Robert Redfield, that is on peasant society and culture. Peasant society and culture by Robert Redfield, where he is trying to understand that how we can have the understanding about the meaning of the little community, or what one can say will be a little community. And somewhere we also try to see that can we see village as a little community. So, can we see village as a little community? That is going to be an instrumental thing, so that we can have a better understanding about what the villages are. And in order to understand this little community, Robert Redfield has spoken about in terms of the 4 characteristics, especially if he tries to see that what were the 4 characteristics that he was referring to. He was talking about the little community in terms of smallness, then he was trying to see it in terms of distinctiveness, then we have the element of homogeneity, and we also have the issue of self sufficiency. So, I think these are the 4 characteristics which marks any entity to be seen in terms of the little community, and here the basic understanding is that it tries to understand the village as a little community. Now, when we try to speak about the issue of smallness, so smallness in terms of what? Basically, we try to see that smallness is to be seen in terms of the so called face to face interaction, face to face interaction. So, the smallness is to be seen in such a fashion that the people are knowing about each other in a face to face situation, and more than that, I think it speaks about also the geographical limitation in terms of the territory, in terms of what you can say the area, and also the smallness is to be seen in terms of that the people are accessible to each other in day to day affairs. So, that is the idea of smallness. So, village, as we try to see that village is normally marked by the smallness, because the understanding is that people in a village, they know about each other, they know about the inhabitants, they know about the rural settlement, the location in that sense, and also they try to understand that who are the people who belong to this particular village. So, smallness is to be seen in terms of the physical proximity, in terms of the face to face interaction, in terms of the informal relationships. So, I think that is the notion of smallness which we try to see, and that represents how village can be seen as a little community, and that of course, is an important characteristics of a village. Then second important characteristics which is going to be more relevant is trying to speak about the notion of distinctiveness. Now, distinctiveness, with that we mean to say that we are trying to speak about that how the community has to be visualized, and the basic understanding is that the people should know that where the community begins and where it ends. So, the people, the population of that particular setting should be in a position to understand that what is the what are the limits of the community. That is, we try to see it in terms of either the field, in terms of the house, which is the last house, which is the starting house, which is the last field, which is the first field in that sense. So, we try to see that this distinctiveness is to be seen in terms of the physical separation of that particular entity from the other neighboring units. And in that way, if you try to see, we try to find out that this distinctiveness is very crucial, because when the people are in interaction, they should know that who is a stranger in their village. Even the person coming from the neighborhood village can easily be identified. So, the basic idea in that sense of course is that the distinctiveness is to be seen in terms of that the people are well aware about their boundaries, well aware about the population, the people, the inhabitants, and also they are well aware about that what are the jurisdiction in which they have to work. So, distinctiveness is to be seen in that fashion, and the village definitely is a marker of that when we try to speak about in terms of the distinctiveness. Then the third crucial thing which comes into existence is the idea of homogeneity, and this homogeneity basically we try to see is to be seen in terms of the various activities and the state of mind. Activities and the state of mind, which are to be seen in terms of having certain amount of relationship, having some certain amount of similarities, especially in terms of the age, in terms of the sex, or in terms of the positions. So, we try to see there are similarities which are there, and these things are basically passing from generation to generation. They are basically passing from generation to generation. So, we try to see that there is certain amount of patterning of the village life. The basic idea is that the people are, or they should be in a better position to understand that this homogeneity has to be marked in terms of the occupation, in terms of the dress, in terms of the food habits, or we try to see even in terms of the spatial language, or basically we try to see it in terms of the local dialect, or even if you try to see the homogeneity in terms of the celebration of the festivals and the fairs, celebration of the festivals and the fairs. So, when we try to speak about these things, the important thing that comes out is that this homogeneity basically tries to cut across the different sections of the society. It makes the uniformity which is spread across the village, and we try to see this homogeneity is also marked in terms of having the sort of solidarity, because this homogeneity may result into the bigger solidarity. So, we try to see that why village are seen as the what you can say the solidified units, and one basic reason for that is that if we have the homogeneity, the element of similarity is going to come, and that will bring about certain amount of unity in the village. So, unity definitely has some linkage with the homogeneity, maybe in terms of laws, in terms of implications, in terms of the process, in terms of the forces of change, or in terms of the specific interventions which are going to take place. So, we try to see that homogeneity is a distinctive character of the little community, which has been talked about by Robert Redfield. And finally, we try to see the basic idea of self sufficiency. Now, when we try to speak about the self sufficiency, the important thing which we try to see as a what you can say a phrase or as a rider of self sufficiency is that the village is seen as a cradle to the grave arrangement. And when we try to speak about that, the basic understanding is that this cradle to grave arrangement basically speaks about the fact that the basic needs of the people, the population in the rural setting, that are going to be fulfilled by the understanding of what you can say the idea of the people in terms of their day to day requirements. And when we try to speak about the cradle to grave arrangements, it basically speaks about the fact that village are to be seen as the closed unit. Now, I think when we say that this is basically the village setting in terms of a little community, and which are to be seen as the isolated whole. So, that basically speaks about that the villages in terms of little community are having the limited interaction with the surrounding. And in that way, when we try to speak about that, we basically also try to see that this understanding tries to have the village in terms of the atomistic unit, which have its own arrangements, which have its own adjustment and the specific what you can say the measures which are to be important for the governance of the society. Now, this self sufficiency definitely speaks about one form of understanding of the little community, and that way if you try to see all these characteristics, we somewhere try to locate that village how it can be seen as a little community. But this particular study or the contribution of this concept from Robert Redfield has been put critically by various scholars, and in the Indian context if you try to see, it was basically the B.R. Chauhan's contribution who tries to criticize the understanding of little community, and in one of his famous work, that is a Rajasthan village. A Rajasthan village, and the name of the village is Rana Bato Ki Sadri. So, in this village Rana Bato Ki Sadri, basically B.R. Chauhan was speaking about the what you can say understanding of the little community, and there he tries to see that there are certain commonality which are been seen and has been discussed by Robert Redfield, especially the question of the smallness that was quite visible with regard to the village. Even in terms of distinctiveness also, we try to see that there were certain amount of arrangements which has been there. People were knowing about their boundaries, they were clear about the worship of a specific deity, the local deity in that sense as such, and people were what you can say in relation to that particular deity. So, that distinctiveness of that village was been represented through the specific worship of a deity, the local deity, and that make it distinct from the other villages. And also in terms of homogeneity, although there were some variations which has been reflected by B.R. Chauhan, but apart from that, for all practical reasons certain amount of homogeneity was been visible when we try to see the village Rana Bato Ki Sadri in terms of the homogeneity. But the point is that when we try to speak about the last element, that is the self sufficiency. So, when we try to see village in terms of a little community having an element of self sufficiency, we try to find out that this understanding has some limitation, because when we try to speak about, we try to find out that this self sufficiency has to be seen in terms of the fact that when we have the marriages. So, for the marriages, and as we know that the villages are normally marked by the village exogamy. So, if we have the village exogamy, so then how we can speak about the question of the closed unit, how we can speak about the self sufficiency, because for the marriage purpose the brides are to be brought from the outside village, and if that happens self sufficiency of the village is broken. So, we try to see the notion of the village exogamy in terms of marriage is going to break the arrangement, and apart from that we also try to see that this self sufficiency can also be broken when we try to see it in terms of economy. Like the village can be the producers of many things, but especially when we try to speak about certain items like the spices, or we try to speak about certain other arrangements in terms of the finished goods. For that we try to find out that the villagers have to depend upon the outside setting, and in that way we try to find out that the element of self sufficiency in terms of the economy, in terms of the production of certain items are restricted, and the village has the linkage with the outside setting. So, we try to see that this understanding sometimes although have some limitation, but still for understanding the village as a little community makes some sense, and that way we can relate the idea of little community to the village. so that we can have a better understanding about the village setting. Now, moving down to another important concept, that is speaking about the folk urban continuum, and that has been spoken by Robert Redfield. Especially he was speaking about a life in a Mexican village, and the name of the village was Tepoztlán, which is basically seen in terms of an understanding about the village in continuity with the outside world. Now, here when we try to speak about the folk urban continuum by Robert Redfield in the analysis of the Mexican village, and I think when we try to see this understanding, we try to find out that people like Oscar Lewis also has spoken about the relationship between the folk urban continuum, that is the linkage between the Mexican village and the Indian village, which he tried to study, and which was basically an outcome of the comparative analysis of the setting. So, he also was trying to focus upon this issue of the folk urban continuum, but speaking practically about Robert Redfield's contribution in terms of the folk urban analysis, we try to find out that it was basically the idea of folk which was important for Robert Redfield. So, when we try to see the folk urban continuum, although we try to see that how folk urban continuum can be seen, we basically try to see that the folk urban continuum are to be seen in terms of understanding the relationship that is there between the rural and the urban. And when we try to see the contribution of Robert Redfield, he was basically trying to study the Chencom village, which was basically seen as the village where he was trying to locate the understanding of folk, and this folk is basically which is basically the part of analysis that how folk has to be visualized. So, one thing which we can see is that when this notion of folk urban continuum was being discussed, in the interpretation and analysis of that, Robert Redfield was lesser speaking about the notion of urban, and he was talking more about looking to the folk society as the ideal society, In his whole analysis, he was giving more focus on the folk society as, and in contrast to that, he says that what is opposite to this is urban. So, what is not folk is urban, that is how he was trying to have the relationship, and this mental construct was basically seen as been created by Robert Redfield in terms of analysis of the folk society. Now, for us the important question is that how we try to see that folk as a type of society, and here we try to find out that this society is basically marked by certain characteristics, that what type of society is, it is such a society, which is small, isolated, then non-literate, and also we have the element of homogeneous structure, homogeneous with regard to the sense of social solidarity. So, we have the non-literate component and we have the homogeneity in terms of what one can say the sense of solidarity, and this is basically leading to the specific coherent structure, which we try to see in terms of what one can say the basic idea of the culture. So, the folk in that sense is been marked by the element of a specific culture, which is unique in its own way, and what is more important in the society is that the kinship relationship are going to be prime, and basically we try to see that the familial groups are seen as the unit of interaction. Familial group are seen as the unit of interaction. That is what makes us to the understanding of the folk. And beyond that, if you try to see further, we try to see that there is an element of sacred. The element of sacred is there, which is over and above the so called secular, and we try to see that this society has the economy, which is not to be seen in relation to the market, but to some extent we try to see that there is certain amount of sacredness which is prevailed, and the economy of the status is to be seen in terms of having certain amount of exchanges, which are going to be important aspect when we try to speak about the understanding about the folk society. Now, Redfield was basically concerned about the folk pole of the continuum. The folk pole of the continuum, where he was trying to speak about that something which is not there in urban is going to be representing the folk pole, and this is how he was trying to make a linkage with regard to the urban. So, we have on the one end the folk pole, and on the other side we try to see that we have the urbanized. Now, that urbanized urban society is to be seen in terms of an ideal type again, which has the due representation of the market, and when he was trying to speak about these issues, the important thing is that the folk urban continuum, which has been talked about by him, was basically an extension of the dichotomy which has been raised by people like Mene, then we have Tönnies and Emil Durkheim. So, the contribution in terms of the dichotomy by these peoples were considered to be important, and Robert Redfield also was trying to hint about that we can see the folk and urban continuum in terms of the specific dichotomy, that on the one side we have the folk, and on the other side we have the urban. Now, what can be the possible characteristics of urban? The urban in that sense has to be seen as having certain amount of what you can say secularization, that is going to be an important element, because the society has to be marked by the so called secularization, and there is also to some extent we have the sort of disorganization of culture, which is going to be important, and beyond that we try to see that the level of individualization has to be seen. Which is going to be crucial when we try to see that in terms of the arrangements, in terms of the people's understanding, we try to see that the element of heterogeneity is going to dominate. And we try to see that this heterogeneity, individualization is going to be spoken in terms of what one can say speaking about the urban. Now, when we try to see that how there is a exchange which is there between the folk and the urban, we basically try to find out that the folk is basically seen as one polar end, and it has its linkage with the urban in terms of maybe speaking about the market economy, or we try to see that we try to have an understanding in terms of certain amount of migration which is going to take place, and that basically see the connect which has to be seen with regard to the understanding about the urban in terms of a specific setting. And we try to find out that there is certain element of the folk urban progression which is going to take place. And here we try to see that how the two elements are going to have the exchange. Basically, when we try to speak about the sort of relationship, I think folk society is been marked by the what you can say the practices of agriculture and the allied activities, but urban if you try to see has the different criteria, and we basically try to see that when we have the sort of exchanges in terms of the market economy, we try to see that the people are moving or exchanging the good in terms of this particular society. Now, one important thing that comes to our mind is that when we have the so called pure folk, I think as he has referred earlier that the folk has to be seen in terms of the specific arrangement which is seen as an ideal type, but then again the ideal type cannot be localized in a specific setting. So, what is to be understood is that there is no pure folk in that sense, and we basically try to see that this pure folk in that sense is not going to be clear cut available in the existing reality, and it has its linkage with the urban. Similarly, we also try to find out that when we try to speak about the relationship, we try to see that these arrangements are to be seen in terms of the continuity. And what is this continuity? Basically, the continuity is seen in terms of the exchanges which are going to take place. Like when we try to speak about the folk pole, and on the other we have the urban pole. So, how we try to see the linkage? We basically try to see that on the one extreme there is one type of one polarity, and on the other we have the urban polarity. Now, these two are having the linkage. It is not that the folk is completely in isolation, and the urban also has its bearing with the rest of the world. So, we try to see that how the folk urban continuum has to be seen in terms of the linkage. We basically try to see in either of the way, like we try to see the shift or the directionality of the folk, which is basically moving from the folk to the urban pole. Now, let us say if we try to have different understanding, let us say we are talking about the three entities, three settings, the three concentrations in terms of A, B and C, and we try to find out that this A, B and C, how we try to represent them in this folk urban continuum. So, we say that like A, if you try to speak about the A, then we try to say that the folk pole and the urban pole, they are basically the two extremes, and A is located at the midpoint, right. So, the A may be having the elements of both the folk and the urban, and in terms of exchanges also we try to see certain bearings of the urban are going to be there when we try to speak about the A, but A in that sense is going to be seen as having the mix of the two in terms of the representation. But if you try to move towards the B, so the B basically if you try to see, we try to find out that B is closer to urban pole, and if that is true, then we try to see that the B will have more elements of urban as compared to A or as compared to the folk pole. So, we try to see that B has the more concentration of the urban, it has more understanding about the urban as compared to A. And then when we try to speak about the C, the third category, then we try to say that okay, C is more rural, it is more folk as compared to the other two. Now, these things are to be seen in terms of continuum, in terms of the linkage, in terms of the relationship, and what is going to be important is that on the basis of that we may try to have certain amount of labeling, like we can say that when we try to speak about B, we can see it as a small town, or when we try to see A, we try to see it in terms of a specific kasbah, and when we try to see C, then we can call it as a small village. So, I think we try to see that this transition speaks about that we can't have the 100% of urban and we can't have the 100% of rural. So, we have to see in terms of degree, in terms of the relativity. So, we have to see the folk urban in terms of certain amount of relative understanding, it has not to be seen in terms of an idealistic situation that this represents the folk and this represents the urban, because even in the urban also we may have number of variations. We may speak about the town, we may speak about the city, and now we may speak about the mega city. So, we may keep on continuing in classification of the city towards the urban side, and in the folk side also we can have the village, we can have the big village, we can have the new villages which are going to be modern villages in that sense as such. So, I think both the extremes, if you try to see, they are not representing the homogeneous component, but they are basically trying to speak about certain amount of bearing of either the folk or the urban, and that tries to give a color to the understanding of the folk urban continuum. Now, moving down to the another concept, that is trying to speak about the concept of dominant caste. Now, dominant caste, as we try to see, basically the concept of dominant caste, as I shared earlier, that it has been talked about by M. N. Srinivas, and when he was trying to refer it in terms of a critical understanding, he was basically trying to see in terms of a social life process in a rural setting. And this dominant caste, if you try to see in a real sense, it basically tries to speak about the analysis of the hierarchy of the specific multi-caste village. Hierarchy of the multi-caste village, and this particular village is to be seen, what M. N. Srinivas was trying to speak about is the village which we had studied is the village Rampura, where he was trying to see it as a composite unit which is composed of the multi-caste arrangements, and he was basically referring to the peasant community, basically the Ukaligas, as the category of the dominant caste. And this dominant caste, basically if you try to see, the dominant caste is to be represented by this peasant community, that is the Ukaligas, which are basically seen as having certain amount of land holding, significant land holding, and apart from that they are also the controller of the power. And if you try to see the dominant, what is going to be important is that what is a caste may be dominant if we have certain characteristics in the mind, that is what we have in terms of the preponderance numerically over the rest of the population. So, the preponderance numerically is seen as one of the important characteristics to make some caste to be the dominant in that sense, and apart from that we also try to see it in terms of the holders of the economic and the political power. That is again going to be true when we try to speak about the understanding about the dominant caste, and beyond that certain other characteristics which we try to refer is we try to see them in terms of the education, that is they are to be educated, and apart from that we also try to speak about that a caste can be dominant if it is ritually pure. If these characteristics are there, basically we try to see that apart from these characteristics, what is going to be more important is basically, as I suggested, Ukaligas were the land holders. So, holding of land definitely is a crucial variable when we try to see it in terms of the rural setting. So, we try to find out that the people, that caste which are numerically more in terms of number as compared to the other caste, or they are economically well off in terms of land holding, possessions, and also having the political power in terms of what one can say the decisive power. the power through which they can make a decision in that sense as such. And also we try to see education, which is seen in terms of the modern education, which is going to be an important issue, and the ritually pure, whereby basic understanding is that it should be restricted to the twice born, that is the upper caste categories only. But if you try to see these things, we basically try to see that these are the typical characteristics of making a specific caste to be the dominant caste. But the basic idea is that when we try to speak about the dominant caste, we basically try to say that what makes a caste to be dominant. It is not that all the characteristics which I mentioned are going to be important or relevant when we try to speak about the understanding of the dominant caste. He says that either of these characteristics or the combination of these characteristics can lead to make a specific caste to be dominant. Because if we would have said that ritual purity is going to make a caste to be dominant, meaning thereby that it is only the so called Brahmins or the Kshatriyas which are going to be dominant always, but that is not true, because sometimes they are not numerically more. So, it is not one element alone which can make a caste to be dominant, but maybe the arrangement of the different caste in terms of its representation, in terms of its number, in terms of their location in the political structure, and also in terms of the education. If we try to see, we sometimes try to say that the caste has to be dominant, and we try to see that this understanding of the dominant caste which he tries to see in the village Rampura, he was basically trying to refer to that how this dominant caste was seen as an important arrangement to bring about the order and solidarity in the society. Because to him, since he was a structural functionalist, so he was basically referring to that what may be the possible function of what is the possible function of a dominant caste. And in that sense, if you try to see, so as a structural functionalist, he says that the purpose of the dominant caste is to bring about the specific order, the social order in the society, and also to create the or to resolve the conflicts. So, the basic purpose of course is the resolution of the conflicts, so that the society will have the harmony. So, we try to see that these arrangements have been part and parcel of the village. The dominant caste plays a crucial role, and this dominant caste is sometimes going to be even over and above the so called panchayats, or even when we try to speak about the arrangement in terms of the legal institutions also. So, the dominant caste sometimes can have the different relationships, although we try to say that this dominant caste sometimes is giving lesser chance for the other caste in terms of providing space for their resolution, but we try to see that in a specific order everybody cannot be into the power structure. So, those who are in the power are the controller of the situation, and this particular relationship in terms of a dominant caste is been seen as that these dominant caste categories are basically the decision makers of the village. Now, we moved on to another important concept which is we try to see is an important concept, that is speaking about the Judgement system. Now, this Judgement system, I think if you try to see, is another important concept which has been referred by various sociologists, especially when we try to speak about the relationship which is there between the different categories, especially Judgement system includes what? It basically tries to speak about the intercaste relationship. Intercaste relationship, and it is basically seen as a system of distribution of services, distribution of services, distribution of services, that is basically how we try to see the linkage as such. Like we have the various lower caste, which may include maybe the carpenters, we have the potters, then we may speak about the blacksmith, or we may speak about the water carriers, and also we have the sweepers in the village, and also we have the ironsmith, or one can say that speaking about the contribution in terms of what one can say the laundryman, that is the DHobi. So, we have the different categories of people who are part and parcel of the village, and these lower caste basically they are in a specific arrangements, they are basically seen as the service providers to the other caste categories, and we try to see that the relationship which has been there between the different castes, they are basically seen as been reflected in the various arrangements. It is basically from the life to death, that is birth to death. We try to see in the different arrangements the different caste categories they try to represent, they try to contribute in terms of the service providers. So, we try to see that these relationships are sometimes seen as more stable, and they are basically passing from generation to generation. And I think when we try to speak about in terms of the passage from generation to generation, I think we try to see that it is seen as something which is institutional, because it has certain amount of stability, it has certain amount of acceptance, and it also speaks about the cultural value of that particular setting, cultural value of that particular setting, and in that way we try to see that the linkage of the various caste groups is been reflected through the Judgement system, and the person who can be attached with regard to the study on the Judgement system is trying to speak about it's W. H. Weiser, who was speaking about the Hindu Judgement system, that is the work Hindu Judgement system, where he was basically speaking about the village setting, and the village that he had studied is the village Karimpur, and in this village what he was trying to see that what is the function of a system of the Judgement system. It is that it is providing all necessary products and services, and the Judgement system function is to maintain in a specific Indian village a aspect of self sufficient system. So, we try to see that the village which we try to see in terms of the self sufficiency, and it is basically the Judgement which is going to create certain amount of relationship which is to be there, and the services are fixed. Basically, we try to see that the different caste groups they are trying to have the relationship, and these relationships are going to be not eternal, but I think they have been continued through generations. But what is more important which we have to see that we have to see Judgement system in terms of the patron client relationship, and this patron client relationship is basically which has been talked about by Weiser in terms of what you can say Judgement and Kameen. So, we have the Judgement and we have the Kameen, that is the relationship which was been there, and basically we try to see that the patron or the Judgement they were basically seen as the service takers, and the Kameens are basically the service providers. So, we have the relationship between the service providers and the service takers. So, that is the relationship which we try to see, and this relationship is not seen in terms of equality. I think that has to be admitted that the relationship is one sided. Basically, we try to see when the service providers are at the receiving ends, they are from the lower caste. So, sometimes they try to have certain amount of subordination, and one may even admit that there is a element of slave mentality which is involved basically when we try to speak about the lower caste who are acting as the communes, and how this system is going to be carried forward. Weiser has rightly said that why the people are not moving or leaving the villages. So, one answer which can be given is that although they are been put into that system, but what is more important is that this system is also bringing certain sense of security. Sense of security, basically the economic security or the social security, which is going to be important. So, the Judgement are basically seen as the protectors, they are seen as the people who are safeguarding the interest of their communes, and that is how we try to see that this linkage is going to be more meaningful. But what is more important is that this sense of security also is seen as leading to certain amount of exploitation, because it has been said that once you are into that Judgement, so you can't move away, and it is not the question of an individual, it is basically the question of the familial ties. So, it is not the individual alone which is involved, it is basically the members of the family which are basically been seen in terms of a shift. Now, one thing which also has to be pointed out in terms of a specific characteristics of the Judgement system is that the Judgement system is also marked by the presence of one important component, that is, in the case of Judgement system, what is more important to be seen is that in this exchange of services, the important thing is that the item or maybe the sort of payment, that payment has to be made in terms of kind. Now, I think this is the crucial characteristics of a Judgement system, that the payment are to be made in kind and not in cash, or maybe it can be in cash on demand, but in the ideal situation we can say that the Judgement relations are seen where the payments are made in kind. That is one characteristics. Second characteristics of course is that the payment is also not immediate, it is not immediate, rather it is flexible. So, it is not that the person is contributing and he is immediately paid, it is not like that as such. We basically try to see that when the Judgement takes the services, it is not necessary that he will be immediately giving the payment to the communes, because that may involve certain amount of flexibility in terms of duration. It can be a month, it can be a year, because in the rural setting as we know that if somebody who is basically into the so called producing of the crop. So, what he will do of course is he will take the services from the carpenter, from the potter, from the blacksmith, from the water carriers, but he will not give him the immediate return. And when his crop is going to be finished, and basically when his production is carried forward, then he may give it in terms of the grains or in terms of what you can say certain other things as such. So, we try to find out that the kind is seen either in terms of grain or in terms of cloth or in terms of certain other things as such, which can be seen as the important bonding which is going to what you can say help the other group also to get the return. So, this sort of relationship which we are trying to speak about is speaking about the exchanges which have been there, and as I said that although it has certain amount of exploitation, because here if you try to see the relationship, it is not two way in terms of the equality. So, it is not two way in terms of equality, but what is more important is that the relationship is continued, and in that sometimes we can say that rationality is not involved, because when we try to speak about the payment. So, the element of rationality is not very much involved basically when we try to speak about the contribution. And the important thing is that when we do not have the rationality, it means that you have your own logic, you have your own ways of looking to the things. And if you try to see apart from Weiser, the other people who have spoken about this issue of the Judgement system, we may speak about the contribution of Thomas O. Bedelman, who has spoken at length about the village life, a comparative analysis of the Judgement System. That of course is the important work by Bedelman, who had tried to rework on Weiser's contribution. And then we also have another prominent contribution by Harold Gold, who had also spoken at length about a critique of the Judgement System and trying to rework about the Judgement System in a new way. Then we have also the contribution by E.R. Leach, who also tries to speak about the nature of interdependence between the different caste groups through the Judgement System. So, one can say that many contributions have been taken place, even M.N. Srinivas, and for that sake S.C. Dubey has spoken about the intercaste relationships in their work. McKim Marriott too had spoken about the intercaste relationship in terms of the Judgement System, which has been reflected in their work. So, I think that is another important concept which we try to see. And finally, the smaller contribution which we try to see again by M. N. Srinivas is speaking about the concept of Sanskritization. So, I think when we try to speak about concept of Sanskritization, as we have shared earlier also in the previous understanding, that Sanskritization is basically seen as a process of mobility which has been reflected in the caste system. And when M. N. Srinivas was speaking about that, he was saying that what is Sanskritization? It is basically seen as a process in which the low Hindu caste or the tribal group, low Hindu caste or the tribal or the other groups, they try to change its customs, rituals, ideology, customs, ritual, ideology, and the way of life, which is a wider term, way of life. And this way of life is to be seen in terms of what? In the direction of in relation to the high caste, and this high caste basically is called as the twice born caste. So, people they try to imitate the behavior of the so called twice born caste, and that is how we try to see the changeology which takes place. And when we try to speak about the Sanskritization, it is basically seen as a process of upward mobility, that is basically the practices which are being spoken about by the lower caste, and they try to imitate the behavior of the upper caste. But what is more important is that when M. N. Srinivas was speaking about the Sanskritization in his famous work, that is Social Change in Modern India, he was basically referring to the changes which are there in the rural setting, especially through the process of Sanskritization. And we try to see that this Sanskritization basically is depending upon that what is the local dominant caste which is going to be important, and according to the nature of the dominant caste, we try to see the different forms of Sanskritization. Like we have the Brahmins as the dominant caste, so we will have the Brahminization of the caste groups. If we have the Kshatriyas, so we have the Kshatriyization of the caste groups as such. So, these are the things which are basically being seen with regard to the understanding about the process of mobility among the different caste groups. But one important thing which M. N. Srinivas has mentioned and which has been reflected is that when we try to speak about the Sanskritization, and as we all know that the caste system is seen as a closed group. So, what M. N. Srinivas was speaking about is that Sanskritization is only going to bring about the positional change in the society, but it is not going to bring about the structural change. It is not going to bring about the structural change in the society, meaning thereby that by the virtue of Sanskritization, it is not that the lower caste is going to come upper in the strata if he is trying to have the understanding of or if he tries to have the behavior of the Sanskritization, and it is simply that the acceptance of that particular caste is going to be done in a fairer way. And in that way, if you try to see, we basically try to see that it is seen as a source of motivation, inspirations for the lower caste to have the upbringing and socialization on the pattern of the twice born the upper caste, which may lead to the higher order of Hinduization. Although the contribution of M. N. Srinivas has been criticized, that why and how the functionality of Sanskritization has to be seen, and many scholars have tried to criticize about that contribution, but I think Sanskritization again is seen as another important concept in the domain of rural sociology, which we try to see. So, I think we have the battery of concepts which are going to be seen in terms of sociological analysis of the rural sociology. As I said that Mackenbier's contribution of universalization and parochialization in terms of little tradition and great tradition is another significant work. By Mackenbier, where he is trying to speak about the exchanges which are there between the two traditions which are there in the Indian society. But if you try to see in a very categorical sense, so I think these exchanges between the little and the great tradition speaks about the fact that they are trying to see that how the smaller elements can have the linkage with the wider elements, the micro having the linkage with the macro entities, or the macro can have the limitation with regard to the micro entities as such. So, that is how we try to see the linkage which is going to be there, and one important thing that comes out of course is that if we have the analysis of these concepts, it will lead to the better understanding about the rural sociology, and that will help us in better understanding about the rural society. So, I think friends, with these words I think we will try to see further that how we can have further arrangements and understanding about the rural society in terms of sociological analysis, so that our rural sociology can be seen as a specialized body of knowledge, and if you are trained in that field, I think you can have a better command for understanding the rural social phenomenon in a typical sense. So, I think that is all about this which we have tried to speak about in terms of the sociological analysis of the rural sociology. With these concepts and words, I think let us try to be familiar, and we try to with these words I think we should be more clear about the better understanding about the rural sociology, and we may have further discussions in the other units which will be of use for all of you. Thank you.